The primary purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. The views, information, or opinions expressed by hosts or guests are their own. Neither the show nor any of its content should be construed as investment advice or as a recommendation to buy or sell any particular security. Security-specific information shared on this podcast should not be relied upon as a basis for your own investment decisions. Be sure to do your own research. The podcast hosts and participants may have a position in the securities mentioned personally through sub-accounts and or through separate funds and may change their holdings at any time.
Welcome to This Week in Intelligent Investing, where we examine timely and timeless investing topics to help you become a better investor. Enjoy authentic, unscripted discussion featuring Phil Ordway, Elliot Turner, and other thought-leading investors, brought to you by MOI Global. And now, here's your host, John Mihaljevic.
Welcome, everyone, to this special episode of This Week in Intelligent Investing. Great to have my co-hosts, Elliot Turner and Phil Ordway, with me, as well as a very special guest today, whom Phil will introduce. Phil, over to you.
Thanks, John. So I should start out by thanking loyal listener Adam Schwartz for making this introduction today to our special guest, Spencer Jakab. Many of you will know him as the editor of the Heard on the Street column in the Wall Street Journal, which I certainly have been reading forever and seen his byline many, many times over the years. Before that, he wrote the Head of the Tape and the Lex column, actually for the Financial Times. And actually before that, which is something I want to talk about, I think it was about 20 years ago, he made the move from being an analyst at Credit Suisse, and he was at one point the director of emerging market research, and made the jump over to journalism. So Spencer's written a book called The Revolution That Wasn't: GameStop, Reddit, and the Fleecing of Small Investors. He was kind enough to send us an advance copy. I read every word of it. I was fascinated by the whole thing. Before we just started recording, I told Spencer I think this whole episode's going to go down with, everything from the Dutch tulips up through LTCM and beyond as just kind of one of those seminal moments in financial history that we're all going to look back on 10 and 50 years ago, or 10 and 50 years from now, and just kind of shake our heads and wonder. And I thought the book was fascinating. Spencer actually covers a lot of that history in the book. So Spencer, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I want to jump right in. And I think the part of this that I still can't wrap my head around, and I'm curious as to your answer here. You lay out a whole litany of causes and factors as to kind of how we got here, right? And so it's everything from the gamification of trading apps, the crossover between this and online sports gambling, the ubiquity of trading apps and the cost-free or lack of commissions, the boredom of the pandemic, the stimulus checks that came with the pandemic, the social media power of reinforcing social behavior, just kind of the randomness of human behavior. This sort of behavior has happened at least somewhat similarly before. Even some things that I think are kind of further down the list, like, the lack of faith in systems, the lack of faith in our market economy. Which one of those factors do you think stands out, or are you like me in that I almost portion kind of equal blame on those factors?
I guess it's hard to say. I think that if any of those pieces had been lacking, then this wouldn't have happened in the way that it did. I mean, it was really a perfect storm. So I think that if you didn't have $0 commissions, there's no way that it could have happened. It would have been impossible, right? I mean, and it wouldn't be possible to trade 10,000 times a year if you're a small money investor, obviously. Even if it were $5, you'd be, spending 50 grand just on commissions. But I think that you kind of psychologically cross a Rubicon when somebody tells you that something is free. And I think what these brokers, because Schwab and Fidelity, everybody else went over to make trading free in late 2019, and they were worried about it. They didn't rely so much on commissions. They could make money without having commissions, but it was a big source of income for them. And so when they matched Robinhood, which was the pioneer in doing this, they thought that it was going to be bad, but they just had to bite the bullet because so many people were opening accounts there. And what they didn't understand was that trading is fun. For these young people, trading is a form of entertainment. And when something that's entertaining and something that's fun becomes free, then you take as much of it as you can. You overuse it. You overdo it. And so that was a crucial element. That this could not have happened without that. Social media, though, I think I was a bit naive going into this. I kind of compared this to like an amped up Yahoo Finance message board from 20 something years ago. And it isn't. I mean, I think my understanding of social media has improved dramatically as just through researching this book, and speaking with social psychologists and experts in influence and in how someone becomes an influencer. And that's a vital element too, because the way that messages are amplified and the way that other messages are buried. Let's say Phil, who was a very reasonable guy, went on some message board on the internet, one frequented by people who are into YOLO trading. The people who did this and said, I put 5% of my portfolio into the stock, and here are my 5 reasons. A cerebral argument is going to put people to sleep on that board. No offense, but it's not going to rise on the board. Now, let's say that somebody else goes on there and says, and even if it's not true because it's a pseudonym and there's no way to verify it. I took out a second mortgage on my house. I bought out of the money call options on this stock. It's going to the moon, 10 rocket ship emojis. That is much more likely to be upvoted on a forum like Reddit, or you're much more likely just by expressing self-confidence to get followed on one of those social networks like Twitter or Facebook, or TikTok or YouTube, where you get followers and you get subscribers. Right. And so this is a case when more extreme, more confident behavior rose in terms of attention, and more nuanced behavior didn't even get seen. So when you had 10 million young people come into the market who are accustomed to getting advice on everything from influencers and from strangers in social media, they didn't even see Phil's message. They saw the crazy message, and that was normalized. That kind of behavior was normalized, and that was seen as kind of how you invest. And so that was a pretty important part of it too. And so it's hard to say which one could have happened with the other. And then, of course, the pandemic just supercharged everything.
Right. No, I totally agree. You can never get a crazy event like this without 3, 4, 5, 6 things all working in the same direction. But I on the topic of social media, I found that particularly interesting too. You do go into a lot of the background there, and you interviewed some really interesting people. I should mention at the beginning, by the way, that I think I'm in the same boat, that I totally underestimate social media a lot of the time. I also have a love-hate relationship with it, but I think this might have been one of the greatest opening lines in a book I've ever read. When you wrote, "I'll never forget the day I found out my sons were degenerates." And by that, you meant that you realized that they were actually on Reddit, right? And yeah, reading this sort of thing. So through their eyes, is there a big gap between how you see it and how they see it?
Yeah. It's
this whole
funny.
episode.
So my sons are pretty sensible boys, but I have 3 boys. One will have nothing to do with social media. He's the sensible one, the middle son. But the oldest and youngest were on this forum, and my now 15-year-old, just last week, I tell me if you get this. He explained to me, said I showed him a meme, something I saw on Twitter. He said, "Dad, it's not a meme." I said, "Yeah, it's a meme." He said, "No, because by the very fact that you're showing it to me is not a meme, because you're too old to appreciate a meme and show me. You don't even know what a meme is." I said, "Yeah, it's a meme. What are you talking about?" So, I mean, it's like, I think I understand, what it is. I think I got the joke. And I mean, and a lot of them are pretty funny, but according to him, and he's probably not the only one, I'm just completely clueless and just the wrong age and the wrong mindset to kind of get it. And the central, not to jump ahead, but one of the central characters in this story, who I think you guys would get along with, because he had a lot of the values of patience and analysis that a value investor, that a successful value investor has, but also became the hero to this meme stock army, which is Keith Gill. I mean, he wasn't known as Keith Gill to the people.
Right.
I follow his journey from beginning to end. And the funny thing is, through 90% of this story, I follow his journey, but he was kind of ignored. He was a nobody. He was kind of made fun of for almost the entire time for, doubling his money. And people are like, "Dude, you should sell." And he, explained, "No, that's not how you, do it. And this is a common behavioral bias," and kind of, boring them to death. And then once he became thrust into the spotlight, because he's 34 years old at the time this happens, and, very much sort of I guess, still the right age to do this. He just started posting these brilliant memes and screenshots of his account. Nobody knew who he was, and that he was a CFA, by the way. And his influence rocketed a millionfold on these forums, and he became the person everyone looked to. He could have made a fortune 10 times as much if he had just used a little bit of his influence to enrich himself, and he didn't.
Yeah, I think that's part of it that I totally and completely underappreciated until the past, call it 24 months. His techniques on Wall Street Bets are almost exactly the same techniques that Elon Musk uses on Twitter, right? And he's the world's richest man right now. So a corollary to that theory that I have is that it's this amazing feedback loop between a very small group of standard bearers, so in this case, Keith Gill and Elon Musk, and this army of almost entirely anonymous or pseudonymous users on social media. So would you agree that this would have been completely and totally impossible if social media like Reddit or Twitter required verification of users and you had to be under your real name?
Maybe. I'm not sure about that, because look, you have to understand the nuances between different types of social media. So you have Reddit. Reddit is, if I were to go on Reddit, I think I have a karma of 1 on Reddit, so which is as low as you could possibly have. You can't be 0. But if I were to put a post on Reddit that somehow went viral, then I could be on the front page of Reddit. If enough people liked it, if the thing I said was funny or dumb enough or whatever, and I happen to use my own name because I'm a reporter. I'm not allowed to have a pseudonym when I go and approach people. That's why I have an account. But there are people on Twitter. Elon Musk is a real person. I mean, there are a lot of people who are real. There are a lot of people who have kind of names that aren't their real name, but there are a lot of people who do use their real name. And so there's Facebook and there's TikTok and there's YouTube, and those are all based on followers. And I think that's why those social networks are more valuable, by the way, and Instagram, which is the part of Facebook, as we know, but that's a very valuable social network where if you're Kim Kardashian, people are going to follow you. If you're, Jane Doe, people are not going to follow you necessarily. And Reddit sold for, I think the founders of Reddit got like $10 million, I think each, or in total, I can't remember now, when they sold it initially to Condé Nast, which is just chump change in Hollywood, right? I mean, this was when Facebook was taking off like crazy, and Murdoch paid a bunch of money for MySpace, and it just wasn't. Those pseudonyms don't make it that valuable, but they did play a role, because it was a perfect place for this to happen, because you could be really boastful about stuff you did, and people felt very safe sharing things they did and sharing screenshots of their finances with their name blacked
That's what
out.
I mean. I don't think anybody'd be sharing this stuff if they had to put it under their real name. I also don't think you'd get the really crazy, the death threats and the super macho behavior and all that kind of stuff, which I think would have kept a big lid on all this thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. Yeah, I think it was a perfect place for it to happen. And and it's where all the kind of the crazier aspects of it emerge from too.
But I think you're right that some people still do that under their real name. So it's not necessarily about pseudonymity versus, having to stand up to certain actualities of who you are. But also, I think the pandemic and living life virtually through, like, mediating through a screen with people perhaps was a confounding factor there. Where people had to do that. And I did latch on to that quote where you cited the Washington State University grad students and the study of those who express confidence getting, and albeit being wrong, getting twice as many followers as those with nuanced predictions. Like, it's not the land of nuance. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Maybe talk about that a little more too. Yeah.
I mean, if you are, and this doesn't have to be on social media. This has always been true. And I think that it's been, even before psychology was a formal study, I think people understood this to be true. I think politicians and demagogues especially kind of innately understand it, that if you're very confident in your assertions, even if they're wrong or they're fishy, or it's just kind of, there's an obvious flaw in them, the more confidently you state them, the more likely people are to listen to you. And the more hedged you are, they're like, well, I think that there's a chance, and there might be, and on the one hand and on the other hand. So if you're that type of person, it's the fox and the hedgehog. If you're more likely to be correct, and you're also much more likely to be ignored. So that's, and this guy, Keith Gill, who I follow the story through him, he transformed in the way that he communicated. I don't know if it was intentional, or I think it was intentional and not in a way to gain more influence, but I think he did it because I think he was afraid that he was gaining so much influence. So he didn't say things explicitly. He didn't say, I think this is a good stock. He never said, I think you should buy the stock. He certainly never said, you should all pile into the stock because I did. But he realized how influential he had become. And he did have a job technically as a financial advisor, though he didn't have clients. And so he was treading a kind of a dangerous line there. And I think, I don't think he stepped over it, but I think that he must have been cognizant of it. But by doing that, and by just having these funny memes and the screenshot of his account without his name on it, he became really influential. And then there's another thing called social proof, which is part of this, which is that, I don't know if you've ever flew someplace, flew to the West Coast or came back from a trip to Europe or Asia, and you were up in the middle of the night, and this stuff is still on TV. If you're ever up really late, there are these infomercials, and it's some guy getting out of a fancy car in front of a house with like a blonde under each arm and a boat and a Maserati, and he wants to sell you a course. And of course, they're going to show you, all this stuff because he's got all this stuff, probably rented it, but he's got all this fancy stuff, and so he must be successful. He must be somebody to listen to. And then they show you somebody just like you, some kind of schlub, type of person who's up in the middle of the night and worried about money and how they transform their lives, and they're testimonial. And so that played a big role too, the whole idea of social proof and of sympathizing with people who were like you, as opposed to listening to experts. Expert opinion has really been kind of downgraded the last several years. I think it's, you can blame whatever, but I think I'm not going to get political here, but I mean, certainly the last 6, 7, 8 years, the trust put in journalists and experts generally has declined dramatically.
Yeah, that is without a doubt. I also want to ask about Robinhood a little bit. I've been openly critical of Robinhood on here. You go into quite a bit of detail about Robinhood and its business model, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm curious as to what your big takeaways would be about Robinhood's culpability in this whole thing as an arms dealer. Again, those are my words, not yours. But then also, I want to get your thoughts on one thing that you wrote that I kind of disagreed with, was that you had this attitude that curbs on this sort of behavior to try to stop this from happening would potentially restrict free speech or economic opportunity. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that, because I agree that there's a whack-a-mole element to this whole thing, that if you clamp down on Robinhood specifically, or if you clamp down on one area of speculation, it's kind of human nature that it'll pop up again in some other form very quickly. But I don't see a ton of downside in doing it, at least for any short-term benefit. Like I don't think I agree that it would stop any sort of progress, I guess.
Well, okay, I'll answer the second part of your question first. Okay. So let me clarify. I don't think that. I think I point out that that's what they say. So that's how they defend themselves. Like if you say anything to Robinhood, they're like, you're just trying to hold people back. We're democratizing finance. We're democratizing investing. You just want people the kind of, to stay, basically they're not saying it in so many words, but like stay poor. So Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, as you know, both came out and criticized Robinhood specifically. And, what do they have to gain criticizing Robinhood? Nothing. Does it matter to them? If anything, if you're the type of person who benefits from Mr. Market being irrational, then you would like these people to keep doing what they do, right? If you were completely self-interested, then you like manias and you like panics because you can take advantage. That's good for a patient long-term investor like them. So they were, I think, being totally altruistic, and they got attacked by the PR people of Robinhood. And at the same time, if you have a social network that hurts people, the sort of move fast and break things attitude like Facebook and whatever, where teens harm themselves and things like that, they'll say, like, you're restricting free speech. It's the First Amendment. Both social networks and Robinhood will wrap themselves in the American flag and the First Amendment and economic opportunity and yada yada. And no, I don't agree with the argument that it would violate it at all. I think that something could be done. I think it's very difficult to do anything. I think that those defenses will prevail, because not only are those defenses very kind of potent and they just go back to the same playbook again and again, but also they've got good lobbyists, and consumer advocates don't have as much pull. And so I think that this is a country, unfortunately, where gambling gets legalized and all kinds of stuff that shouldn't, that should be more restricted, and there should be guardrails. The guardrails eventually get taken down and eroded because there's too much money to be made. So I don't like Robinhood's business model at all. It's a race to the bottom. I mean, they're not serving their customers well. And I think it's the basic truism that, when you're investing or you're doing anything with money, you want somebody who's paid on the back end, not the front end. And they are very much paid on the front end. So their whole business model, the way that they can have so many people with tiny accounts, not charge them commissions, is that they get paid for routing the orders. That in 2020, that was about 80% of the money they made. And the rest was like margin lending and lending out stock and things like that. And they want you to trade a lot. And the whole app is set up to, it's not, they don't want you to lose money, but the whole app, all the behavior that they encourage is deleterious financially to an investor. Trading a lot, FOMO, checking your account a lot. Their active investors check their account over 7 times a day.
Right. Yeah, that's something that's so tough, and I'm so torn about, because on the one hand, it does truly democratize investing, driving these commissions down to zero. You'd imagine someone with $100 when commissions are $10, even buying the spiders. Yeah. Right. To have 10% of your stash go to commissions, you're fighting a big headwind in compounding. On the other hand, I think the study you referenced about the change in turnover going from $2 to $1 commissions and then from 1 to 0 was like an exponential effect. And I know there's sites that, like, when you do something that's contra a goal, you have to pay a fine to a friend for, just to impose some sort of discipline on your behavior. And that zero commission kind of takes away any sense of discipline, rationality, or patience. And you could act with compulsion instead of thought. And that seems to have been a big problem.
And they want you to act fast. I mean, they make it so frictionless because but that's the thing is, then they have a lot of competitors too, a lot of copycats, because that's what you need to do to succeed. I mean, I think Silicon Valley gets that. So I'm sure that you guys talk a lot about investor psychology and behavioral finance and things like that. And the thing is that human psychology, the human psyche, hasn't changed for a long time, won't change for a long time. It changes very slowly, right? I mean, it's developed over eons. So that's why you have manias, panics, and crashes, because humans are the same. And then there's always a new group that comes into the market that hasn't experienced the thing the last group has, and they go through and they make the same mistakes again. And the same people will make the same mistakes again, even. But what has changed is the understanding of psychology that these guys have. And they understand just the way casinos understand psychology, right? A casino knows that you're going to have when you have those bars go around, that cherry, oh man, if that cherry had just been 1 bar higher, I would have made the jackpot. I was so close. It's a near miss. Or look at that person won all this money from the casino. Lights went off and whatever. Why does the casino celebrate when the lights, when someone wins a lot of money from them? It's because it encourages everybody else to gamble more. Somebody's got to win, but that the house always wins in the long run. Why is it this color? Why do they have these bright lights? Why do they have these, they're all things. I mean, the one thing Robinhood doesn't do is give you free drinks, when you're gambling, right? I mean, but everything else
gives you a free stock though.
Gives you a free stock, exactly, which is a lottery-like element. And it gives you confetti, although they took away that feature. So they understand the psychological buttons that they're pushing, and social media understands the psychological buttons they're pushing. I'm sure you guys all have Facebook accounts and things like that, and you don't check it for a while. You get an email. Hey, it's been a while. Hey, your friend posted. Hey, look what you're missing, right? I mean, they need you to engage, right? Because you don't pay anything for your Facebook account, but you are the product, and you are the product in the same way for Robinhood, except in a more explicit way, because they need you to be active. And some, okay, and I just wanted to go back to another thing you said, Elliot. You said that, oh, well, it's good, you have mixed feelings because they democratize finance. I think that finance has been democratized already. So all the competitive pressures that led us to where we are today and all the technological advances, I mean, isn't it pretty miraculous that for a $0 commission, you can buy SPY for 0.03% and not check it, and they're not going to charge you any money for not checking your account or not trading? You could, invest for almost nothing. And all those studies you see, well, if you had just invested $1 back in 1926, you'd have this many dollars. No, you wouldn't, right? First, there's no index fund. Just reinvesting dividends would have cost you money. Everything would have cost you money. There were no tax efficient wrappers. There was nothing. You just were getting, and plus, if you had $1, nobody would take your money in 1926. You had to have a lot of money for brokers to help themselves to it, right? So, it's great where we are today. It has been democratized. You don't need Robinhood to do it for you. And Robinhood to me is the dark side of that. And it's like so many other things, right? I mean, like we have all this nutritious food available year round that like our great grandparents, couldn't have dreamt of. And then we eat Cheetos, right? I mean, like, you've had like everything's become so easy and so cheap, but then doesn't mean that we'll act in the way that's best for ourselves, because the people want to sell you Cheetos, right? I mean, so that's what's happening. I think it's good that people are at least young people are opening accounts and developing an interest in finance. That's the one good thing.
Right. I agree. And I have this notion that finance kind of takes every good idea and then just takes it too far. So I agree. I think the real groundwork in quote unquote democratizing finance happened 40 years ago, right? When commissions were deregulated and Schwab came on the scene and Vanguard came on the scene, and now we've probably gone too far. So I wonder if you have a forecast or any thoughts on where we might stand on the regulatory landscape, because for basically a century, we seem to get progressively weaker regulations in response to crisis. You rightly point out that the Great Depression got us the SEC, Enron and WorldCom got us Sarbanes-Oxley, the financial crisis got us the Volcker Rule. Do you think anything will come of this, and will the pendulum start to swing back a little bit?
I think that there might be something. I'm kind of pessimistic, to tell you the truth, because I think that there's just too much money to be made and too much financial interest, and the arguments, and they're not my arguments, but the argument, kind of wrapping yourself in the American flag kind of thing, democratizing finance, are just too effective. So I think that some rules might emerge specifically from this episode. One thing to note is that people did lose money, of course, but it's not like 2008. It's not like 1929. Right. It's not like 2000, where the American middle class lost a ton of money, right? This was seen as a good thing. And people were mad that their trading was restricted. And that's a big part of the story. There's all these conspiracy theories about, it was hedge funds colluding to save themselves and let the people trade. We want to trade. So it's kind of the opposite. But I think that you need a scapegoat for things. So I think that rules on short selling are likely to be tightened, which is not a good thing in my opinion, because short sellers, they're just people out there trying to make money like everybody else. They perform a vital function in terms of providing liquidity, but more important, they provide a vital function to mom and pop who hate them, because Enron would have been Enron for a lot longer if they hadn't been active in trying to make money from exposing it, and Valiant and all these other things, and tech stocks and other stuff would have stayed elevated a lot longer. So I think that if you're a retail investor and you're buying individual stocks, you don't know what the right price is. You have all kinds of biases and all kinds of BS, and you have analysts recommending stuff that's vastly overvalued today. So, there's just no way mathematically a lot of things are going to work out that we're talking about. And you have analysts on Wall Street, despite all the and I used to be an analyst, although in emerging markets, but despite all the rules about conflicted research and stuff like that, there are all kinds of other pressures that make them kind of go along with it. It's very hard to put a sell on Tesla, right? And then, and it's not very good for your career, by the way, especially if you did it a few years ago. So, I think that short sellers might face some tougher rules, which is not going to, it's going to hurt them, but it's not going to help anybody. Maybe disclosure rules that make it more difficult for them to operate. What I would love to see is some friction added to the process. I mean, this is like Bernie Sanders is a big advocate of this, and that he really for all the wrong reasons. It's more kind of a soak the rich kind of thing, but he wants a trading tax. But if you were to institute a small trading tax and then not allow kind of holes in the system where people trade virtual shares and things like that, or tokenized shares or contracts for difference, then you I think would make people more thoughtful. And you can have, of course, there are all kinds of things you have to be careful for. You don't want to hurt retirement funds and stuff like that. But I think there's a way that you could design it where you could slow things down and nobody really would be harmed. You'd raise a little bit of money and you'd make people a little bit more thoughtful. And it's not going to happen, but that's what I would like to see.
I totally agree. That's what I'd like to see. Unfortunately, I think I share your pessimism on that front, just based on the incentives and the lobbyists and the inertia involved. What about payment for order flow? Because you mentioned, and I agree that you couldn't have had this happen without quote unquote free trading, and you never would have had free trading without payment for order flow. And I did have to note there was a quote in the book from Sean Casten, who coincidentally represents me in Congress, and he said referring to Robinhood, there's an innate tension in your business model between democratizing finance and being a conduit to feed fish to sharks. And that would seem to cut across party lines and seem to be something that whoever you are, you could get behind, right? Because that should be relatively obvious that you can have it one or the other, but not both. So do you think payment for order flow will persist, or do you think that's likely to get clamped down on, just like some aspects of short selling?
There's some, I think it's too entrenched. I mean, I think there's a possibility that it will be regulated more or restricted. And let me just say that this went from something that only wonky people who knew about market structure talked about ever before this episode to something that's seen as this kind of this evil, nefarious thing. It's not evil and nefarious because I looked, very carefully at how it's done, and the way that that brokers dole out where the orders go, the way that it's paid for. I think they thought about making the process fairly transparent and whatever. The thing is that's what makes this possible. That's the only bad thing in my mind about payment for order flow. I mean, it makes everything possible. It is efficient. It's the one area really where retail investors are treated better than the big boys, because they would never, have like a black box filling orders in the same way for the big boys, because you could exploit it by putting through huge orders. But these small orders don't rock the boat, and so they're more profitable to process, and so they're actually processed more cheaply than a mutual fund's orders. But if you got rid of payment for order flow, I think maybe Robinhood could survive, because there are people who don't use it. Like Fidelity doesn't use it, and they do the same thing themselves because they're so big that they internalize their trades, so they kind of match them internally to some extent. So I think it's just one piece of the puzzle, but I think that maybe Robinhood wouldn't have become what it is today for sure without payment for order flow. I think it perhaps could still stay in business and still could charge zero, but it wouldn't be as profitable.
It is. I have to note that as we're recording this, they've just reported their quarterly results that were quite poor. They're losing users and forecasted some pretty weak revenue. And the stock is getting absolutely crushed as we're recording this on the 27th
I'm editing,
of January.
editing a column for Herd on the Street right after I get off with you about those results. So I've got an eye on it.
I will be fascinated to see. I want to ask two closing questions as we bump up against time and let you get back to your real job editing Herd on the Street. So first of all, let me say that at the end, I think if anyone could, if you can't read the whole book, which I would recommend reading the whole book, if you have to, just read the first and the last chapter is kind of your coda to the whole thing, which again was like the opening to this whole saga to me was like, wait a minute, these retail investors are trying to stick it to the man by trading more often. Like, it's just so backwards and counterproductive. And you wrote quite perfectly, I think, the way to stick it to the man is by not playing his game. And later you added that the only certainty with a fund or any investment is its cost. And so I'll give you a chance to elaborate on any kind of closing words or advice for people. And I'd also be curious if you have any thoughts on what this will look like in, say 3 to 5 years. Are the apes still going strong? Is this whole thing still rolling, or is Robinhood dead and gone and forgotten? Is this all just kind of a footnote in financial history by then?
Yeah. So thank you very much. The whole ape thing is very strange. And that's one thing, I guess I'm both pleasantly and unpleasantly surprised, because as somebody who spent the last year buried in this and staying up late every night and every weekend and vacation writing the book to get it out for the anniversary, it's nice that it's still a thing, right? Because the apes are still there. It's still a story. They're trying to make lightning strike a second, third, fourth, fifth time, and they're not succeeding because they're financially naive. It's all based on crazy theories. Somebody described it as the QAnon of finance, where they say that there are all these phantom shares and this big conspiracy. I think that these conspiracies never totally go away, but they just sort of, people eventually drop out of it. And it's really based on, you don't even know what it's based on now. There's supposed to be the mother of all short squeezes, where they financial firms lose $1 trillion because they're phantom shorts. And, it's like the most reasonable thing you could say to these people, like, okay, let's say that you're right. Don't you think that all these smart people on Wall Street who spend their decades looking at this stuff and analyzing stuff would know about these phantom shorts also, and also be trying to make $1 trillion? I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense. So I think that some group of these people is just going to linger for years. It doesn't kind of matter, but it matters to my mentions on, I don't know, if you see like a lot of 1-star reviews of my book on Amazon, I'm going to guess that they're already seeing like, hey, give this guy a 1-star review on Goodreads and Amazon and stuff like that. So that kind of stinks. That's not nice given how much work I put into it, but it's a kind of a vindictive bunch. But it's going to take a long time to fade away. In terms of how to treat it, that's the way to treat it, is just if you don't like Wall Street, and I understand why young people feel some bitterness towards Wall Street, even though they're young. Yeah, then don't pay it a lot of money. You're doing like the opposite of what you should be doing. It's like, I hate McDonald's. Hey, let's all go to McDonald's all on the same day and go to the drive-thru and order 5 Big Macs, and then they'll run out of Big Macs and they'll be in big trouble. It's kind of like doing that. Like, I don't think McDonald's would really mind that, right? I mean, so it makes no sense, but it's also difficult to engage with these people, and I don't try to online, because it's just, you just go down a endless black hole,
Right. Yeah, that's never going to end well for anybody. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of the line, I'll never forget the day I found out my sons were degenerates. I had a similar experience around, it would have been in the spring of last year, when I was playing in a golf tournament, a very fancy high-end country club with a couple of guys that were probably in their 40s or 50s and very wealthy and successful. And then the caddies, who were probably your son's age. And within maybe 15 minutes, they asked what I did for a living, and I told them, and it immediately jumped onto, they all owned AMC, GameStop, Dogecoin, the whole thing. And that's when I said, wow, this is much, much broader than I thought. So my antidote to that is going to be, I'm going to buy several copies of this book. The title, again, is The Revolution That Wasn't GameStop, Reddit, and the Fleecing of Small Investors, because I do get this question a lot from people that are perfectly capable of understanding it, right? If you're willing to risk thousands of your own dollars, you ought to be willing to risk a few of your own hours to read this book. And I think it'll certainly appeal to any of our listeners out there that are into financial history and behavioral psychology and the craziness that permeates this market that we all operate in. But I think it's also an important book for small investors, as you wrote right there in the subtitle. So, Spencer, thank you very much for joining us. This was a real pleasure, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care.
Thank you for listening to This Week in Intelligent Investing, brought to you exclusively by MOI Global, the research-driven membership organization. Learn more at moiglobal.com.